The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was not a single event, but a drawn-out process that unfolded differently in different regions and at different times, shaped by political circumstances, by the strategies of individual missionaries and kings, by the resistance of local communities, and by the internal logic of a Norse spiritual tradition that was, in some respects, more resilient than the Christian missionaries anticipated. Norway was formally Christianized during the reigns of Olafur Tryggvason and Olafur Haraldsson in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, though the process of genuine conversion, as opposed to formal political submission to the new faith, took considerably longer and was marked by significant pockets of continuing pagan practice in remote rural areas. Denmark had been nominally Christian since the mid-10th century, when King Harald Bluetooth declared himself the king who had made the Danes Christian. But here too, the depth and sincerity of the conversion varied enormously across different social levels and geographical areas. Sweden was the last of the Scandinavian kingdoms to formally adopt Christianity, with the old pagan temple at Uppsala, which Adam of Bremen described in such horrified detail, remaining a center of active pagan worship into the late 11th century, and genuine Christianization of the Swedish countryside, taking several more generations beyond that. Iceland, which had adopted Christianity as its official religion at the Althing in the year 1000 inches, a famous compromise that allowed pagan practices to continue in private, maintained a particularly complex and nuanced relationship with the old religion throughout the medieval period, one that is reflected in the extraordinary richness and fidelity of the Icelandic literary tradition's treatment of Norse mythology and belief. The strategies employed by Christian missionaries and church authorities in Scandinavia to deal with the deeply embedded spiritual significance of wolves and ravens were varied and not always consistent, reflecting the broader diversity of approaches that characterized the Christianization of Northern Europe more generally. The most direct approach was straightforward condemnation, the denunciation of the old animal associations as demonic, superstitious, and incompatible with Christian faith. And this approach is reflected in the various church canons and penitential texts that were produced for the Scandinavian churches in the early medieval period, and that explicitly prohibit practices associated with animal worship, animal augury, and the kind of ritual identification with animals that characterized the Berserker and Ulfethna traditions. The Council of Closho in Anglo-Saxon England, for example, condemned the practice of what it called the imitation of animals. And similar prohibitions appear in various Scandinavian ecclesiastical texts of the conversion period, suggesting that the practice of ritual transformation into animal forms was widespread enough to attract the attention and the condemnation of church authorities across the Germanic world. These prohibitions tell us, by their very existence, that the practices they condemned were genuinely common and genuinely persistent, that they did not simply disappear when the formal structure of pagan religion was dismantled, but continued to be practiced, presumably in increasingly covert ways, long after the official conversion. A more subtle and more effective approach than simple condemnation was the one that modern scholars sometimes call interpretatio Christiana, the reinterpretation of pagan religious elements within a Christian framework, a strategy that sought not to destroy the old associations, but to redirect them, to harness the emotional and spiritual power of the pre-Christian tradition in the service of the new faith. This approach had ancient precedents in the history of Christian mission, having been recommended by Pope Gregory the Great in his famous letter to the missionary Augustine of Canterbury at the very beginning of the English mission in the late 6th century, in which Gregory advised that pagan temples should not be destroyed, but should be purified and converted into churches, and that pagan festivals should not be abolished, but should be given new Christian meanings and redirected toward the celebration of Christian saints and martyrs. Applied to the wolf and raven associations of Norse culture, this strategy produced some remarkable results, reframing the sacred animals of the old tradition within a Christian moral and narrative framework that preserved much of their emotional resonance, while fundamentally altering their spiritual significance. The raven, which had been the messenger of Odin and the attendant of the sacred dead, was reframed as a bird of ill omen associated with the devil and with the dark powers of pagan superstition, a reframing that preserved the raven's association with death and with supernatural knowledge, while reversing its moral valence from the sacred to the diabolical. At the same time, however, the raven was also incorporated into Christian hagiographic tradition as a bird associated with certain holy men and saints, appearing in the lives of various Celtic and Scandinavian saints, as a creature that could serve divine purposes when properly directed by holy power, a role that preserved something of the raven's function as a mediator between the human and the divine, while thoroughly Christianizing the nature of the divine in question. The wolf's treatment in the Christian reinterpretation of Norse animal symbolism was, as we have already noted, primarily negative, with the wolf being identified with the devil, with heresy, with the predatory forces of evil that threatened the Christian flock. This identification was reinforced by the extensive biblical tradition of using the wolf as a symbol of danger and spiritual threat, a tradition that extended from the prophets of the Hebrew Bible through the New Testament's warnings about wolves in sheep's clothing to the patristic literature of the early church, providing a ready-made framework within which the Norse wolf could be reinterpreted as a Christian symbol of evil. The result of this reinterpretation was a profound transformation in the cultural status of the wolf in Scandinavian society, a transformation that was not merely symbolic but had real practical consequences for the way in which actual wolves were treated, as the association of the wolf with the sacred and the divine gave way to an association with the demonic and the evil. The inhibitions against killing wolves that had been maintained by the old spiritual framework, inhibitions rooted not in any explicit prohibition, but in the awe and the respect that the wolf's sacred status generated, gradually dissolved, and the organized persecution of wolves that characterizes the later medieval and early modern periods in Scandinavia became possible in a way that it had not been under the old pagan dispensation. The transformation of the cultural status of wolves in post-conversion Scandinavia can be traced with some precision through the changing content of the legal frameworks that governed human-wolf relations across the medieval period. In the earliest Scandinavian legal codes, which preserve elements of pre-Christian legal tradition, even within a nominally Christian framework, the wolf occupies its familiar, ambiguous position, simultaneously a threat to be defended against and a creature of sufficient dignity that the killing of wolves is treated as a matter requiring careful legal regulation rather than as a simple act of pest control. The designation of the outlaw as a varg, a wolf, which appears in these early codes, implies a degree of respect for the wolf's nature, even in its negative application, a recognition that the wolf represents a genuine and formidable alternative to the social order, rather than merely a contemptible or despicable threat to it. By contrast, the later medieval Scandinavian legal codes, produced in a thoroughly Christian cultural context, treat wolves in exclusively negative terms, as vermin to be exterminated, and the elaborate bounty systems and communal wolf hunts that appear in these later codes reflect a cultural attitude toward wolves that has been thoroughly purged of the ambivalence and the reluctant respect that characterized the pagan tradition, the folk traditions of Scandinavia, which are in many ways a more reliable guide to the persistence of pre-Christian spiritual attitudes than the formal literary and legal record, because folk traditions are transmitted through channels that are less thoroughly controlled by the cultural authorities who might seek to suppress or transform them, preserve numerous traces of the old sacred associations of wolves and ravens that survive the conversion and continue to shape popular attitudes toward these animals throughout the medieval period and into the modern era. Scandinavian folk belief about ravens remained remarkably close to the pre-Christian tradition, in many respects maintaining the raven's association with Odin, who survived in folk memory under the name of various disguised forms, including the figure of the wandering old man with a broad-brimmed hat and a staff, who appears in numerous Scandinavian folk tales and who is recognizably the old god in his most familiar guise, and maintaining the raven's role as an omen bird, whose behavior could be read for signs of what was to come. The practice of raven augury, of interpreting the calls and the flight patterns and the behavior of ravens as messages from the spirit world, persisted in Scandinavian rural communities long after the formal conversion, and was documented by folklorists of the 18th and 19th centuries as a living tradition that their informants had learned from their parents and grandparents, a chain of transmission that reached back through the generations toward the pre-Christian past in which this practice had first been developed and systematized. The figure of the raven in Scandinavian folk belief retained, in particular, its association with Odin's role as a god of the dead and of the spirit world, an association that manifested in widespread folk beliefs about ravens as the transformed souls of the dead, as creatures that carried the spirits of the departed between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and as omens of impending death, whose appearance near a house or a person was a sign that the spirit world was making its presence felt in the material world. These folk beliefs, while thoroughly embedded in a Christian cultural framework that understood the afterlife in Christian rather than Norse terms, nevertheless preserve structural similarities to the pre-Christian understanding of ravens as mediators between worlds that are too consistent and too specific to be entirely coincidental. They suggest that the spiritual significance of the raven as a boundary creature, a being that existed at the intersection of the living and the dead, and that could carry information and influence across that boundary, was sufficiently deeply embedded in Scandinavian spiritual culture that it survived the formal replacement of the mythological framework that had originally produced it, persisting in the form of folk belief and popular superstition, long after the theological context that had given it meaning had been officially replaced by Christian doctrine. The wolf in Scandinavian folk belief presents a more complex picture than the raven, because the wolf's transformation from sacred animal to diabolical threat was more thorough and more complete in the official cultural record, leaving less room for the preservation of the old positive associations in folk tradition. Nevertheless, even in the folk traditions of the post-conversion period, the wolf retains a quality of supernatural power and spiritual significance that distinguishes it from ordinary animals, and that speaks to the persistence of the old sacred associations beneath the surface of the official demonization. The werewolf tradition, which appears in Scandinavian folk belief under various names and in various forms, is the most obvious and the most extensively documented expression of this persistence, maintaining the old connection between human identity and wolf nature that the Norse tradition had expressed through the concepts of the Ulfhethna, the Hamrama, and the Fylgja in a new form that was theoretically compatible with Christian theology, since the werewolf in Christian tradition was understood not as a practitioner of sacred shapeshifting, but as a victim of demonic possession or divine punishment. But the emotional and cultural logic of the werewolf tradition, the fascination with the human being who can become a wolf, with the dissolution of the boundary between the civilized and the wild, with the terrible freedom and the terrible danger of the lupine nature unleashed, is continuous with the Norse tradition even when it is formally opposed to it. And this continuity suggests that the spiritual significance of the wolf as a boundary creature, a being that illuminates the edge between the human and the non-human, could not be entirely suppressed even by the most thoroughgoing program of Christian demonization. The persistence of wolf and raven symbolism in Scandinavian heraldry and political iconography throughout the medieval period provides yet another category of evidence for the tenacity of the old sacred associations. Evidence that is particularly striking because heraldry and political symbolism are domains that are generally subject to careful control by cultural authorities, and that therefore tend to reflect the officially sanctioned values and beliefs of the ruling class, rather than the unofficial folk beliefs of the broader population. The wolf appears as a heraldic device in numerous Scandinavian noble families throughout the medieval period, and the raven appears on the coat of arms of various Scandinavian territories and institutions, including the famous raven flag of the Isle of Man, and various Scandinavian dioceses and municipalities. The persistence of these animals as markers of elite identity in a thoroughly Christian cultural context suggests that their symbolic power was sufficiently deeply embedded in the Scandinavian cultural imagination that even Christian nobles and Christian administrators found them useful and appropriate as symbols of the qualities they wished to project, qualities of strength, intelligence, ferocity, and connection to the deep history of the Norse people that the wolf and the raven had represented for centuries before the conversion, and that they continued to represent in transformed but recognizable form long after. The Renaissance and Reformation periods, which brought significant cultural transformations to Scandinavia as to the rest of Europe, had complex and sometimes paradoxical effects on the status of wolves and ravens in Scandinavian culture. The Reformation's rejection of much of the medieval Catholic symbolic tradition created a cultural space in which older pre-Christian elements could sometimes reassert themselves, not as paganism, which was thoroughly rejected by Protestant theology, but as part of a broader recovery of classical and native antiquity that characterized the humanist intellectual culture of the period. The first systematic scholarly attention to Norse mythology and its animal symbolism began in this period, with antiquarians and scholars across Scandinavia beginning to collect and study the old Eddic texts and the runic inscriptions, and the archaeological evidence of the pre-Christian past, motivated by a mixture of national pride, humanist curiosity, and genuine intellectual interest in the nature of the old religion. This scholarly engagement with the Norse tradition, which would eventually produce the great editions and translations of the Eddic texts that made Norse mythology accessible to a broader European audience, created a new form of transmission for the old sacred associations of wolves and ravens, one that was mediated by scholarship and literary culture rather than by oral tradition and folk belief, but that was no less effective in maintaining the spiritual power of these animals in the cultural imagination. The Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries saw a dramatic intensification of European intellectual and cultural interest in Norse mythology and the Viking Age, an interest that was driven by the Romantic movement's broader fascination with the primitive, the sublime, the pre-rational, and the nationally distinctive, and that produced an extraordinary flowering of creative engagement with the Norse tradition in literature, music, visual art, and eventually in the emerging discipline of academic history and archaeology. The wolves and ravens of Norse mythology became, in this period, potent symbols, not merely of an ancient religious tradition, but of a distinctively Northern European character, an alternative to the classical Mediterranean cultural heritage that had dominated European elite culture for centuries. A heritage that was wilder, darker, more honest about the violence and the fragility at the heart of human civilization, and more aligned with the northern European landscape and its particular qualities of beauty and danger and melancholy grandeur. Richard Wagner's cycle of music dramas, known as Der Ring der Nibelungen, which drew heavily on Norse and Germanic mythological material, and which became one of the defining cultural monuments of the 19th century, placed the wolf and the raven at the center of its mythological vision through its portrayal of Wotan, the Germanic Odin, and his divine ravens, and his association with the wolfish Volsung dynasty, and in doing so brought the sacred animal associations of the Norse tradition to the attention of a vast European and eventually global audience that had no previous knowledge of the Eddic texts or the Viking Age, but that found Wagner's mythological synthesis a resonance that was both aesthetically powerful and spiritually significant. The 20th century brought further transformations to the cultural status of wolves and ravens in the descendants of Norse culture, transformations that were sometimes deeply troubling in their political implications. The appropriation of Norse mythology, and specifically of its wolf and raven symbolism, by various nationalist and eventually fascist movements in Scandinavia and Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, represents one of the darkest chapters in the modern history of the Norse tradition, a chapter in which the sacred associations of these animals were deliberately exploited to serve ideological purposes that were antithetical to the humane values that a genuine engagement with the Norse tradition in all its complexity would reveal. The Nazi movement's use of runic symbols, including the Wolfsangel or Wolfhook rune that was adopted as the insignia of several SS divisions, and the broader Germanic nationalist traditions' glorification of the wolf as a symbol of racial strength and predatory vitality represent a profound distortion of the Norse wolf tradition, one that stripped the wolf of its full mythological complexity and reduced it to a one-dimensional symbol of aggressive power, eliminating the wolf's role as a representation of tragic, uncontrollable destruction and its connection to the fatalistic, deeply humble Norse understanding of the limits of divine and human power. This appropriation and distortion of the Norse animal symbolism has left a complicated legacy that continues to affect the reception of Norse mythology in the modern world, requiring those who engage seriously with the tradition to constantly distinguish between the genuine spiritual insights of the old Norse culture and the ideological uses to which its symbols have subsequently been put. The contemporary revival of interest in Norse mythology and Viking culture that has characterized the early 21st century, and that has been dramatically accelerated by the global success of various popular culture representations of the Viking world, represents yet another chapter in the long history of the transmission and transformation of the Norse sacred animal tradition, a chapter that is still being written and whose ultimate significance is not yet clear. What is clear is that the wolves and ravens of Norse mythology continue to speak with remarkable power to audiences around the world who have no ancestral connection to the Norse tradition and who encounter these animals through the most clear, mediating layers of modern popular culture, rather than through any direct engagement with the original sources. This global resonance suggests that the spiritual truths that the Norse expressed through their sacred animal relationships are not culturally specific, but are universal in some meaningful sense, that the wolf's embodiment of the tension between civilization and wildness, between social order and individual ferocity, between the domestic and the untamable, and the raven's embodiment of the tension between knowledge and ignorance, between the perception of hidden truths and the anxiety of impermanence, speak to aspects of the human condition that are not confined to any particular time or place, but are permanently and universally relevant. The ecological crises of the modern world have given the Norse sacred animal tradition a new and urgent relevance that its original creators could not have anticipated, but that they would, perhaps, have found entirely comprehensible. The extinction crisis that is currently threatening wolf populations across Europe and North America, and the parallel decline of many corvid species in various parts of the world, is not merely a biological tragedy, but a cultural and spiritual one. The loss of the living presences that embodied, for the Norse and for many other traditional cultures, some of the most important truths about the nature of the world and the human place within it. The Norse, who honored wolves and ravens as sacred companions, understood something that modern conservation biology is only beginning to articulate in scientific language. The understanding that these animals are not peripheral or incidental features of the natural world, but are keystone species, creatures whose presence or absence fundamentally shapes the ecological systems in which they live, whose predation and scavenging and territorial behavior organize the landscape in ways that sustain the health and diversity of the whole. The wolf's role as a top predator that regulates the populations of large herbivores and thereby prevents the overgrazing and degradation of vegetation that leads to erosion and habitat loss, and the raven's role as a scavenger and seed disperser that contributes to the decomposition of organic matter and the regeneration of plant communities, are ecological functions of enormous importance, functions that the Norse recognized in spiritual terms as the wolves and ravens' participation in the great cycle of destruction and renewal that they understood to govern the cosmos. The reintroduction of wolves to various European landscapes in recent decades, including the natural recolonization of parts of Scandinavia by wolf packs migrating from Finland and Russia, has been accompanied by social and political conflicts of extraordinary intensity, conflicts that often seem disproportionate to the actual ecological impact of a relatively small number of animals on a landscape that has been dominated by human activity for centuries.